In a town where piety was sacred and secrets were carefully guarded, Reverend Samuel Hayes found himself standing at the edge of temptation. What began as a fleeting moment of weakness, a clandestine visit to the women who danced in the shadows, would spiral into an unforgivable act. The preacher, once a symbol of virtue, became entwined in a dark mystery. And when a brutal murder surfaced, the town was left to reckon with the terrible consequences of a secret they never could have imagined. Reverend Samuel Hayes had long been a fixture in the small town of Fairview. His voice, strong and commanding, echoed through the wooden pews of the church every Sunday, calling the faithful to repentance and devotion. He spoke of salvation, of fire and brimstone, urging his congregation to turn away from sin and follow the righteous path. But behind his devout words, behind the stoic face he showed to the world, something darker stirred within him. A quiet hunger, a yearning that couldn't be satisfied by prayer or scripture, gnawed at his soul. It was late one evening when the temptation first became too much to resist. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the sleepy streets of Fairview. The town was winding down, the hum of daily life fading into the stillness of night. Hayes stood at the window of his modest parsonage, his gaze fixed on the far end of town. It was there, just beyond the church, where the women of ill repute plied their trade, their laughter and music drifting into the streets after dark. He had never dared to venture near them, always too focused on his duties to give them a second thought. But tonight was different. A stirring deep inside him told him to go, to see for himself what lay beyond the veil of propriety that had so long confined him. He told himself it was merely curiosity, that one visit wouldn't hurt. After all, his congregation would never suspect such a thing. Reverend Hayes was above reproach. His heart wavered for only a moment before he grabbed his coat and stepped out into the night. The street was quiet. The only sound, the soft crunch of gravel beneath his shoes. Hayes' heart beat faster with each step, the weight of his decision settling heavily on his chest. The building ahead was dark, save for a dim light flickering in the window. As he drew closer, the faint sound of music reached his ears, accompanied by laughter, low and sultry. The doors were open, and for a moment Hayes hesitated. He stood on the threshold of sin, the very place he had so often condemned from the pulpit. But the door beckoned him. His feet moved on their own accord, and before he knew it, he was inside. The room was thick with the scent of perfume and tobacco smoke. Women in vibrant gowns lounged on plush chairs, their eyes sharp and knowing. Their gazes fell on him as he entered, and for a brief moment he felt out of place, like a man out of time. One woman in particular caught his eye, Clara, tall and striking, with dark curls cascading over her shoulders and eyes that sparkled like embers, smiled at him from across the room. Her gaze was both curious and inviting, an unspoken challenge that pulled him deeper into the world he had only ever dared to condemn. A glass was thrust into his hand, and before he could protest, Clara offered him a drink. Her voice, smooth as silk, whispered in his ear, coaxing him to relax, to forget about his life as a preacher. For a moment, Hayes felt a rush of guilt, but it quickly dissipated as the alcohol warmed his insides and the seductive atmosphere swallowed him whole. He could feel the weight of his collar, the chains of responsibility he had worn for so long, begin to slip away. In the dim light of the room, with Clara's gaze fixed on him, the world outside seemed to fade into nothingness. Reverend Samuel Hayes returned to the dimly lit house of pleasure again and again. What began as a singular, fleeting indulgence quickly grew into something he couldn't shake off, something that seemed to possess him more than he possessed it. Every visit felt like a departure from himself, a relinquishing of his carefully constructed persona as the revered man of God. He couldn't explain why he kept coming back. It wasn't just Clara's striking beauty or the allure of the forbidden. It was something deeper, something darker that pulled at his very soul. The women inside the building were always laughing, their voices a blend of sultry playfulness and raw desire. Each evening, the air was thick with perfume and smoke, the heavy scent filling his lungs as he stepped through the door. The allure of this world, so starkly opposite to the world he had known, became inescapable. They greeted him as if he were a regular, though Hayes knew his presence was different. He wasn't like the men who frequented their establishment, who came for fleeting moments of pleasure and left without a second thought. His presence was quieter, more reserved, his heart constantly battling the guilt and shame that threatened to consume him. Clara was always the first to notice him. She was bold and confident, her eyes always scanning the room until they found his. A slow smile crept across her lips, as if she were waiting for him to make his move, to succumb to the unspoken invitation she had offered from the first night they met. Her laughter was infectious, and Hayes found himself drawn to it, to her. She wasn't like the others. There was something in her eyes that hinted at a depth he hadn't expected. Beneath the veil of her profession, he saw a woman who was both broken and resilient, living in a world that had shaped her into something he didn't quite understand. Their conversations, though seemingly trivial, always seemed to linger in his mind long after he left. Clara spoke to him as though he were not just a preacher, but a man who carried burdens she didn't fully comprehend, but could still see through the facade of his starched collar and polished sermons. Her voice had a way of breaking through his defenses, coaxing him to open up in ways he had never done with anyone. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not as the Reverend, but as Samuel, a man with desires, weaknesses, and flaws. And that terrified him. One evening, after sharing a drink and some casual conversation, Clara leaned in closer. Her words, whispered just below his ear, sent a shiver down his spine. "You come here for more than just company, don't you?" she asked softly, her breath warm against his skin. Hayes froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He had never admitted it to himself, let alone to anyone else, but the truth rang in his mind like a bell. Yes, he came for more. He didn't just come for the pleasures of the flesh. He came for the escape, the temporary freedom from the suffocating expectations of his congregation, the endless demands of his duties, and the guilt that followed him like a shadow. He tried to resist, tried to push the thoughts away. But each time he saw Clara, the temptation grew stronger. The barrier between his two worlds, the righteous preacher and the man consumed by hidden desires, grew thinner, until it seemed like there was nothing left to hold him back. He told himself he could stop at any time, that he could walk away before it went too far. But each night, when he returned to that house, the line blurred just a little more. The night Clara disappeared, the air was heavy with an unspoken dread. It was the kind of night where the wind carried a chill that bit into the skin, and the town of Fairview seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something terrible to unfold. Reverend Samuel Hayes had been there, in the dimly lit house, only hours before. But when he left, something felt off, like an invisible thread that had snapped, leaving a jagged hole in the fabric of reality. The house had felt different that evening, too. The usual sounds of laughter and music had been replaced by an eerie stillness, broken only by the occasional clink of glass or the shuffle of feet across the worn carpet. The women who normally filled the space with their teasing banter now seemed subdued, their faces drawn with a quiet unease that Hayes couldn't place. Even Clara, who had always exuded confidence and charm, seemed quieter than usual, her eyes dark and distant. She had tried to pull him into her orbit once more, whispering seductively, but there was something in her gaze that made him hesitate. Something was wrong. But Hayes had left, as he always did, unable to stay away from the pulpit for too long. He told himself it was for the best, that he could no longer afford to let his mind wander into the darkness that waited for him there. Yet as he walked back toward his parsonage, the weight of the night pressed against him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. He ignored it, telling himself it was merely his own guilt gnawing at him. By morning, Clara was gone. No one had seen her leave. No one had heard a thing. The house, usually alive with murmurs and laughter, was silent. The women who remained in the building spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously, as though they were all complicit in a crime that had yet to be discovered. They said Clara had left in the night, disappearing into the streets as if vanishing into thin air. But Hayes knew better. He could feel it in his bones, in the cold knot of dread that twisted in his stomach. Clara had not simply left. Something had happened to her. The authorities were slow to act. They chalked up her absence to the transient nature of her profession, assuming she had simply moved on, as women of her kind often did. But Hayes couldn't let it go. He started asking questions, though his inquiries only seemed to raise more suspicions. Whispers began to circulate about the preacher's visits to the house. People who had seen him leaving, his face tense, his gait hurried, began to recall the uneasy aura surrounding him in the days leading up to Clara's disappearance. Something was not right. Then, just as the days began to bleed together, a search party stumbled upon the body. It wasn't far from town, just a few miles into the woods, where the trees grew thick and the sunlight barely touched the ground. The body was unrecognizable, beaten and mangled beyond comprehension. Blood had pooled around her, staining the earth dark and viscous. It was Clara. But there was more. The air around the body seemed thick with malice, a dark energy that hung like a shroud. The ground beneath her was disturbed, as if something had been buried and dug up, something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. In the trees nearby, broken branches seemed to form unnatural shapes, twisted like hands reaching out from the darkness. And in the distance, a figure watched. Hayes didn't know if it was real or a trick of the mind, but as he stood over Clara's lifeless body, he felt a cold presence linger, a shadow creeping closer, as though it knew everything he had tried to bury. The walls between his world of salvation and the abyss he had danced with were crumbling. And as the town began to stir with horror, he realized with sickening clarity that Clara's death was just the beginning of something far darker. Something that had begun the moment he crossed the threshold of that house. The news of Clara's body spread through Fairview like wildfire, igniting a panic that the small town had never known. Reverberations of horror echoed in every corner of the community, each whisper darker than the last. But none could have anticipated how quickly the shadows would begin to close in on Reverend Samuel Hayes. The investigation was slow at first, the authorities unable or unwilling to make any real headway. But as the days passed, the small details began to coalesce into something undeniable. Clara had not died alone. Her body, mutilated beyond recognition, bore the marks of violence, signs of a struggle, a frenzied and desperate attempt to escape something far more malevolent than mere murder. The town began to speak in hushed tones, glancing nervously over their shoulders, as if something evil was watching, lurking in the dark corners of their lives. It wasn't long before the rumors started. People began to recall the preacher's frequent visits to the house where Clara had worked. They spoke of his hurried exits, his nervous demeanor, his strained excuses. Reverend Hayes had always been above suspicion, until now. Now, his every movement was under scrutiny, his every word twisted into an accusation. The walls of his once respected persona were crumbling, revealing the rot beneath. His guilt, unspoken but felt in every passing glance, gnawed at him relentlessly. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the town, Hayes returned to his parsonage, his mind weighed down with dread. He could feel eyes upon him, hear the whispers behind his back, each one a thread in the noose tightening around his neck. But as he approached his door, something stopped him. A chill that ran down his spine like a finger tracing the back of his neck. He paused, his breath catching in his throat. The air felt wrong, thick and oppressive, as though something was pressing down on him, suffocating him. It wasn't until he reached for the door that he noticed it. A stain, dark and viscous, spread across the wooden floor. It was a shadow of something more sinister, something alive. Hayes's heart raced as he stepped inside, his pulse quickening with each creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. His eyes darted around the room, scanning every corner, every inch of the place that had once felt like his sanctuary. But now, it felt like a tomb. The house was silent, too silent. His gaze landed on the fireplace, where the cold embers had long since faded. It was then that he saw it, a figure, standing in the dim light cast by the dying fire. A tall, thin shape, with hollow eyes that glinted with malevolent intent. It wasn't Clara. No, this figure was something worse, something unnatural, a presence that seemed to warp the very air around it. For a long moment, Hayes stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. The figure's lips curled into a twisted smile, but no sound came from its mouth. It was as though it existed on the edges of reality, just out of reach, a specter born from the sins Hayes had tried to bury deep within himself. But the figure was real, standing there, waiting for him. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him, the sound of wood crashing against wood reverberating through the room. Hayes spun around, his breath ragged, his mind spiraling into panic. But there was no escape. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing colder, the shadows creeping closer. In that moment, he realized with a horrifying clarity that he was not alone. The figure in the corner had never left. It had always been there, lurking just out of sight, feeding on his guilt, on his hidden desires. It was a thing born from his darkest sins, a manifestation of everything he had tried to repress. And now, it was coming for him. The preacher stumbled backward, his mind racing. He had no words, no prayers, nothing to cling to. The thing in the corner stretched out its hand, long and twisted, like a broken branch. As it reached for him, Hayes could feel the weight of his own actions, the lives he had destroyed, the truth he had buried, coming crashing down upon him. There would be no redemption, there would be no salvation, only the cold, unyielding darkness that awaited him, and that darkness there would be no escape.